Welcome to the first Facebook live event for St. Anne's. My name is Johannes Abeler. I'm one of the economics fellows here at St. Anne's, and I would like to talk about app-based contact tracing as a way out of the lockdown. This is based on research that I've done over the last 2 months with quite a lot of co-authors that are listed on this slide here. Just want to pick out two of them, Raffaele and Hannah, who are Raphael is an MPhil student here at St. Anne's, and Hannah is a DPhil student at St. Anne's, and also in the Department of Economics. Most of the other people are also from Oxford, from the economics department, and from Mannheim. We have three co-authors from Mannheim. So I got into this. I'm an economist, and I'm talking about epidemiology here. I got into this because my wife is an epidemiologist, so she works in epidemiology, and she really dragged me into this. When we talked about this in February, how bad the epidemic will be, I was very depressed for about 1 or 2 weeks, and then I thought perhaps I can help the epidemiologists a little bit from the side, from the social science side, and so I'll talk a little bit about that. But first, a bit of epidemiology and sort of how we got here and how we get out of this. The lockdown that we have at the moment is really a very brutal way of controlling the epidemic. It was necessary because without lockdown, we would have seen, and you've seen all these predictions, we would have seen lots of deaths. But now all countries are thinking about how to leave the lockdown. There are three main ways that are discussed. The one is, don't leave the lockdown, just stay in the lockdown for a little bit longer at least. Or the second one is, could we have a partial opening at least and do manual contact tracing? And I explain what that is in a minute. Or, and that will be the main part of the talk, could we have a partial opening and app-based contact tracing? So let's start with the lockdown. So the good thing about the lockdown is that this is really a very effective way to reducing the epidemic, to stopping infections. The downside to that is that it's enormously costly. So in the UK, you've seen the cost is amazing. Is something around, sort of in terms of GDP loss, is about 8 to 17 billion pounds per week. Just the other day, there were the reports about the total cost to the state of roughly 300 billion pounds, the biggest deficit since the Second World War. And it's not just that there's a lot of cost sort of for the state, but there's also lots of cost for all of us directly. We can't go out and have fun. Our kids can't go to school. We see there's lots of domestic violence. There's all kinds of bad things that are happening. People go unemployed, increased poverty. There's lots of direct effects, not just on the state, but on individual citizens. And we see that these effects are actually very unequally distributed. It's usually the younger ones and and poorer people that don't have a fixed job, that sort of work in the gig economy, that work as freelancers. These are the ones that suffer most. So it's really a very strong cost, which is then on top of that unequally distributed in the population. So yes, we could continue with the lockdown, but it's a very, very, very costly way to do this. So at the same time, a lockdown is not very targeted. So the idea of the lockdown is that we lock away everybody so that nobody can get in touch with anybody else. And then, because you need direct contact between people for an infection, we stop infections immediately. Basically, if we could really lock down everybody 100%, which is obviously not possible, but if we could do that, then the whole epidemic would be over in about 2 weeks. But because we can't do this, it does slow it down. But in a sense, we are locking away the people that already are infected, and we're locking away the people that are not infected. Now, while COVID is obviously a very big epidemic, it is still very rare. At the moment, this week, at the end of a very long lockdown, or after quite some weeks of lockdown, about 0.2% of the UK population are infected currently. So this is out of 1,000 people, 2 people are infected. 2 out of 1,000. So that is a very small number per 1,000 people. Obviously, this is a big number if you add it up across the UK. But it means that we're locking away 99.8% uninfected, healthy people, and 0.2% infected people. So if we could turn that around, that would be much more efficient. If we could find the infected people and just lock them away, just lock 0.2% away, then they couldn't infect anybody, and then we could also stop the epidemic. That sounds much better idea, locking away 0.2% compared to 100%. But the trick obviously is that you have to find the people that are infectious. Yeah? If you have COVID, you don't have suddenly get green hair and we find out who you are. That's the really tricky bit. The way that public health authorities deal with this is called contact tracing. So perhaps you don't know who's infected, but you know who is likely to be infected. And these are the people that get in contact with people or have been in contact with people that are obviously ill. So in a sense, what you're trying to do with contact tracing is that you try to outrun the virus. The virus spreads through our networks. I get infected, I infect my family, they infect their friends, and so on. And so it goes on like a game of domino. And what contact tracing is trying to do is be faster than the natural spread of the virus, faster than the infection chain, overtake the virus, and then isolate people, put people into quarantine before they can start infecting others. This is very effective for very many diseases, and the main way we stop diseases. If you think about SARS is a virus that is very similar to COVID. SARS was basically stopped through contact tracing. And with SARS, the advantage was that people were basically only infectious once they started to have symptoms. So people fell ill, and before they fell ill, so while they were still healthy, there was an incubation period, they felt healthy, they weren't infectious, then they became ill, they went to hospital, and only then they became infectious. So it was possible to find all their contacts and isolate them and put them in quarantine before they started infecting people. COVID, unfortunately, is much more tricky, and here's the reason. It turns out that people become infectious before they fall ill. So we have about 5 days of a pre-symptomatic period for COVID. So people are infected, and then about 5 days later, people get a fever. So on Monday, someone coughs at you, and you are infected. And then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. On Saturday, you develop a fever or a cough. You feel ill. But the problem is, and then perhaps you realize this and you stay home, or you call 111 and they tell you to stay home and to self-isolate. But the problem is you start being infectious about 2 days beforehand. So instead of Saturday, you start becoming infectious on Thursday. And on Thursday, you feel totally fine. You go around, you go to a club, you go onto the tube, and you cough at people, or you just talk to others, and you start infecting them. And it turns out that about 46% of all infections happen in this pre-symptomatic period. So here in the graph that I'm showing you, the light blue bit, that are these infections that happen, that are the infections that happen due to pre-symptomatic individuals. So these are people that will develop the symptoms. They will fall ill, say on the Saturday, but on the Friday and Thursday, they're still running around and they're infecting people. As soon as you develop symptoms, you're also still infectious. This is the dark blue area here. So these are symptomatic sort of transmissions while you're symptomatic. And it turns out, or at least that's our current idea about the virus. Obviously, we're still learning quite a lot about the virus. It seems that asymptomatic people, so people that get COVID but don't really fall ill, they seem not to be playing a strong part in the infections. That's the dark green one. And also these touch infections where I touch something that you've touched, and that's the way I get infected, that also doesn't seem to be playing such a big role. It's really the light blue and the dark blue parts. And here's the outrunning of the virus that comes into play. So we would need to find the contacts so that get infected before they really start infecting others, and that is well before they develop symptoms. So this is really a race against time. It's really, time is of the essence. It shouldn't be called contact tracing, it should be called contact racing, because it's really every hour counts. And that is the problem with manual contact tracing. So manual contact tracing happens that you fall ill, you call 111. They say, oh, we send you a test, or we'd say, oh, you are probably you have COVID. Then you get called by Public Health England, and they go through your diary, what you've done over the last week. You say, where were you on the Friday? Where were you on Thursday? Whom have you met? This has to be sort of longer meetings for perhaps 10 minutes close by. So this would obviously the people in your household, your family, people at work, but this would also be people who would be sitting next to you on the bus or on the tube. So they go over your last week together with you, and then you try to identify everybody, try to find the telephone numbers, and then Public Health England would call them up, try to contact them, and then ask them to self-isolate. Now, the main problem here is that this takes time. Because until they can contact you, until you find all those, you remember who you met, until you remember all these telephone numbers, until they found out all these telephone numbers, this takes time. And it turns out that for COVID, contact tracing, manual contact tracing is probably too slow. So too slow to actually stop the epidemic. So this is a graph I show you is a paper that appeared in Science. Full disclosure, my wife is one of the co-authors on this paper. And they said, given these the share of infections that happen over time while you're infectious, it turns out that manual contact tracing is just too slow to stop the epidemic. So here I show you a graph, the 48-hour graph, where on the x-axis says how many people that have COVID can we find and put into quarantine, and on the y-axis is how many of those people that we find and quarantine, how many of their contacts can we find? And red here means we can't stop the epidemic. We can find perhaps some people, but still the epidemic spreads. You might have heard of this famous R number. So R is above 1 here. So people still infect, or here in the here is little r is per day. So this is if capital R is 1, then this little r is 0. But red basically means the epidemic keeps spreading. And green means we could stop the epidemic, we could bring R below 1. And you see with manual contact tracing, which might take 48 hours between symptom onset and the contact until the manual contact tracers have found all your contacts, it's a very slim bit of green here at the very top. You would need to be super successful. You would need to find 90% of all contacts and get them into quarantine. And manual contact tracing, even done by experienced people, is never that effective. The people you meet on the bus, you wouldn't even remember. You wouldn't even if you do remember, you wouldn't know their phone numbers. So this is not as effective. So we stay in the red. And in a sense, we actually have experience about this, because when COVID broke out in China and sort of started to trickle into Europe and into the UK in January, we had very experienced, very, very good contact tracers on high alert, waiting for this to happen. They did contact trace people that came in here, but you see, they weren't able to stop the epidemic. We then got the big epidemic, and we could only take the big hammer of the lockdown out. So in a sense, we've already tried manual contact tracing, and it hasn't worked. And this is not because these people are not good at it. It's just that the virus is faster than what we can do. So manual contact tracing doesn't work, mainly because it's too slow, also because it misses many contacts. And when you have lots of people infected, it is also hard to scale. It is because it's a very manual, very time-intensive task. So if we were to loosen the lockdown and just rely on manual contact tracing, then we would have a problem. We would get a new outbreak, and we wouldn't be able to control the epidemic. So how is app-based contact tracing different? The main difference with app-based contact tracing is speed. App-based contact tracing would be much faster. So how would an app-based contact tracing work? You will have seen this in the news. There is already a trial on the Isle of Wight. It will work that we all have, or as many people have, an app on their phone that basically keeps a diary, an anonymous diary of other phones that my phone meets. So my phone would send out an anonymous ID that will actually change over time, and other phones would do the same. And my phone would also listen for these anonymous IDs and would basically keep a diary for me of all these anonymous IDs. If I'm not infected, then this diary never leaves my phone. It's deleted after 2 or 3 weeks. So no data would ever leave my phone. Only when I get infected would the NHS ask me, or would Public Health England ask me, could we see your diary? And then I would say yes, and then this diary would upload it to the NHS server, and they could unscramble these IDs of the people I met and send these other IDs a notification. They wouldn't know who that is. They wouldn't know a name or a telephone number. They would just know, oh, mobile phone number 23 was in contact with me, and we'll send this person a notification. And then this person would be asked to actively contact NHS and say, oh, I was contacted by this app, and it asked me to self-isolate. What should I do? Oh, I'm worried. What should I do? As I said, the advantage here is speed, because this notification could go out immediately. And if we come back to the graphs, we looked at the graph on the right, the 48-hour graph, where there was lots of red. If we could do this instantly, you see there's much more green in this graph. So it's not all green. There's quite a lot of red. But if we would be able to find enough infected people, and if we would be able to find enough of their contacts quickly, then we would have a chance to keep the epidemic under control. And if we don't loosen the lockdown totally, these are graphs for a total total loosening of the lockdown. But if we only loosen the lockdown a little bit, then this green area grows, and we have an even bigger chance to stop the epidemic without having to go all out into the lockdown. So app-based contact tracing seems to be a viable option to stop COVID, if the take-up is high enough, if enough people have this app. The problem is here that on the y-axis of these graphs that I showed you is the percent of the success in quarantining the contacts. And you see, if you look at this graph very carefully, if you have perhaps 60% somewhere on the right of this graph, 60% of the contacts, if you can quarantine them, then that will be good. Now the problem is, this doesn't mean that 60% of people would need to have it on their phone, because for a contact to be registered, both people have to have it on their phone. So now this is then the share of contacts that we can trace in that way is the share of people that have the phone times the share of people that have the phone. So the first person has to have it and the second person has to have it. So if 50% of people have it on their phone, then it's 1/2 times 1/2, so that's a quarter. So if 50% of people have it on their phone, then we would only trace 25% of contacts. So you would need a very high share of the population to have this on their phone. And that's really the question, whether people would do that. And that's where my research comes in, where the social sciences can perhaps help, is try to find out and try to predict whether people would download such an app, how many people would download this. Obviously, the proof is in the pudding at some point, so we'll see how many people will download on the Isle of Wight, how many people will download this app once it's rolled out in the UK in a couple of weeks. I don't know when this will be exactly, but at some point it will roll out. But there was a question in March, can we already predict whether this is feasible at all? Will people do it? And also, how can we design the app in such a way that people will download it? So we ran surveys, conducted surveys, representative surveys in 5 countries, in the UK, in Germany, in Italy, in France, and in the US. We did this at the end of March. The US survey was a little bit later, early April. And we asked them, we described this app, we would describe how they would download it and what the possible effects would be. And then we asked them, how likely would you be to install or not to install the app on your phone? And we see that across all 5 countries, across the UK, Germany, France, US, Italy, we see a very large chunk of people would install the app, or would say at least that they would install the app. So green in these graphs is definitely install or probably install. And you see that the share of people that say they would definitely or probably install is in the 70s. It fluctuates a little bit by country, but in general, this is a very high share. We see that, I don't show you the data, but we see that this is actually very similar across gender. Men and women have very similar answers here. It's also similar across regions within a country. And it's also quite similar across age. Old people are slightly less likely to wanting to install than young people, but it's quite similar. We find a strong effect of one question that we ask, and that is whether people trust the government. So people that say they trust the government, they are also much more likely to say that they would download the app. And people on the very right of this graph who do not trust the government are less likely to install the app. And this pattern holds true in all countries. It's not just in the US, where lots of people don't trust the government. You see the same picture there in the US, but you also see it in Germany, where lots of people do trust the government. And you see the same pattern across all countries. We also ask people what would be their main reasons for or against installation. And here I show you, in this graph, I show you the main reasons against installing the app. And we see that the concerns with government surveillance after the epidemic are the strongest. The reason that is most often named as a reason against installing. About 40% of people of our participants say that a reason against installing the app would be that governments could misuse this technology after the epidemic. Most of these say they would still install it, but that's one of their concerns. They also worry that their phone might get hacked. They might feel more anxious if they install the app, or very few people say that might be too much hassle. We also see this already on the Isle of Wight, that it's also often older people who say, oh, I don't actually know how to do this. I would like to install it. I would be willing to install it, but I don't know how to do this, and this is all a little bit too much for me, and that's the reason why I don't install it. But this pilot on the Isle of Wight is still ongoing, so the NHS is analyzing the data at the moment, and I bet they will make these results public soon. Now, you see, our research suggests that there's enough people out there that would be willing to install the app, but there's still quite a lot of questions that remain. First of all, in the public debate, I think sometimes we mix different apps, and it's really important to see that app is not equal to app. A contact tracing app is very different from an app that some countries use to control whether people stick to their quarantine. It's very different to this immunity passport that is discussed. So it's very different, sort of very important to sort of talk about these different apps or app-based technologies around COVID, talk about them separately. Second important thing is that if we find that 70 to 80% of people state an intention to download the app, this doesn't automatically imply that 70 to 80% actually install it. You see, it's my clear stated intention to go out exercising more, and obviously I don't do this as much as my stated intention would make you think. And that's the same thing with many things in our lives, including things like installing an app. Many people might agree that that's a good thing, but they might not get around it. They might not pay attention to this. They might not listen to Sanan's podcasts and might not know that how great this is. And so the actual uptake might actually be lower. So that's why we've also asked what our participants thought about an automatic installation, whether the government asked, say, the mobile phone providers or perhaps the Apple or Google, whether they could automatically install the app, and then people would have an opt-out possibility too. You could deinstall it, but the default would be if you don't do anything, you would have it on your app. And we see that a majority of our respondents would be in favor of that. It's not 70%, but it's somewhere between 50 and 70%. Across all countries, they would be in favor of it. But you must see that the privacy implications of such an automatic installation are much, much stronger than a voluntary installation. This is something that has never happened in Western countries, that a government has automatically installed, even if you could opt out, automatically installed an app on all the phones. This is something that happens in China, but in Western countries, this has never happened. So there's clear privacy concerns to this. There's also privacy concerns, and this is also reflected in the answers, that we want to make sure that this is a system that cannot be misused during the pandemic but also once the pandemic is over, that this system cannot be misused. So it would be very important that we build a system where we automatically return to the status quo before the status quo that we had before the pandemic once the epidemic is over. So I think I would be very much in favor of having actually have a law guiding the use of this app, which clear sunset clauses with a clear with a clear framework that says once these conditions are met, the epidemic is switched. Once we know the epidemic is over, the app is automatically switched off. You will have seen this in the news. There's quite a discussion about a centralized or decentralized system. The centralized and this decentralized system, they differ in what happens once you are infected. So if you're not infected, these two systems are actually very similar in terms of privacy. But if you're infected, in the centralized system, you upload your diary to the central server, to the NHS, and the NHS is sending out alerts. The server of the NHS is sending out alerts. In the decentralized system, these alerts are not sent to the central server, but are sent directly between apps. So you basically send alerts. If you are infected, you send an alert to everybody, to all other phones in the UK, or if this works internationally, to all the phones in the world that use the same system, to notify them. Apple and Google are building a system like that into their mobile phones that will roll out over the next few months. They won't have a contact tracing app per se, but they will build the infrastructure on the phones that any decentralized contact tracing apps could build on top of their infrastructure. So that makes life much easier for these decentralized apps, while the NHS has so far decided to go with a centralized app. But they say they might be open to switch to a decentralized app. I don't want to talk very much about the details or the technical details between these. I think from a privacy perspective, surely the decentralized system is better. But I think for a country like the UK, or for most Western European countries, the threat to privacy and surveillance is probably quite minute, is quite small. This is very different in other countries. So if you're in Hungary, I think the difference between a centralized and decentralized system, or countries like China, will be quite different. It really hinges on whether you trust the NHS with your data. At the moment, all of us trust the NHS with our health data, and so it's a question whether you would also trust them with these kind of data. I think the difference is actually quite limited. I think what we have to keep in mind is why we have this system at all. So a contact tracing system, an app that keeps a diary of all your contacts, is something that if you had asked me whether I wanted to install such an app like half a year ago, I would obviously have dismissed this as totally ludicrous. I mean, having an app on your phone that keeps track of all your contacts, I mean, this is it's a total nightmare. Even though, yes, there's privacy built in and I see that, but obviously I would not have contemplated to install such an app on my phone half a year ago. But now the situation is quite different because the alternative is quite different. The alternative is to a functioning contact tracing system is that we keep on keeping the lockdown in place to some extent with all the consequences for poverty, inequality, kids not going to school, social inequality growing, all these things. Obviously, lots of companies going bankrupt. Companies like St. Anne's. St. Anne's won't go bankrupt, but St. Anne's is very much hit by the financial side of this epidemic. So that is clearly very costly. If we lift the lockdown and if we get a second peak of infections because we don't get the contact tracing right, we'll have new deaths and new morbidity coming through, which is also obviously, I mean, it's just a nightmare whichever way you look. These are the alternatives that we have, and I think we have to keep this in mind, that all of these affect our human rights, our fundamental rights. Privacy might be affected to some extent, data protection, but it's also employment-related rights, poverty, freedom of movement, and obviously right to life, and the chances to die, in particular if you're elderly and frail. or if you have diabetes. So I think in all this debate, also around centralized systems and decentralized systems, we have to keep the big picture in mind, and we have to work together and find sort of the least bad way out of this epidemic. And I think app-based contact tracing seems to be a very promising part of the mix. I don't think we will just get contact tracing. Probably we will have to have some sort of social distancing in place, less than the lockdown. But when we have a functioning contact tracing app out, and if enough people download it and have it on their phone, I think then we can. The more people, let me start that sentence again. The more people have it on their phone, the more we can loosen the lockdown. So and because any non-loosening is very costly, I very much hope that many people will download this app. So if you have more questions, I've listed here some further links, and otherwise I'm also happy to answer questions by email if you see this. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope you stay safe and stay alert.